How long has it been since you had a chest x-ray? And what about an ultrasound examination? Imagine you come into the ultrasound room, but instead of the machine, there's a doctor sitting there silently scanning you, seeing right through you. That's an interesting twist, isn't it? It's just that today's conversation is going to be a bit unusual. We're going to try to delve into the fifth dimension together. You might ask, what does X-ray and ultrasound have to do with it? Nothing surprising there. Welcome to the 5D reality there's nothing to be surprised about. Hubble. Let's start with the smallest zero-dimensional space. Here, everything is almost like in the Bible. In the beginning, there was a point. A point is considered a zero-dimensional object because it has neither height, nor length, nor width. To enter one-dimensional space, you need to connect 2 points. You get a line segment, which has length. Next comes a three-dimensional figure, a square, which consists of 4 connected line segments. A square has 2 parameters, length and width. Many will argue that this is not a journey, but simply a listing of geometric objects. Do you want a real immersion into an alien reality? At this stage, there's nothing difficult about it. To imagine two-dimensional space more clearly, recall what information we need to know the exact location of any settlement on the surface of our planet. Naturally, it's latitude and longitude. Therefore, to travel through two-dimensional space, it's enough to turn on a GPS. And now, welcome to 3D reality here. To describe anything, we need 3 parameters. Height is added to width and length. This is exactly the kind of world we live in. But here's the problem. Humans are not able to see objects in 3 dimensions. That's how our vision works. If we suddenly gained this superpower, we would be very surprised. Even just walking into our own room. Imagine that you've lost your keys. Where could they be? Did they fall under the bed? Are they in the desk drawer? Did someone accidentally cover them with a book? In any of the mentioned places, you would immediately find your keys if you had 3D vision. There would be no visual obstacles for such a person. He could work at the airport instead of a scanner, or in medical centers instead of an X-ray machine, since this unique individual can see through anything. However, this is not possible yet. But to determine the location of an airplane, we still specify 3 parameters. To longitude and latitude, it is necessary to add the altitude at which the object is flying. And if you also take into account the moment in time, then this model can be considered 4-dimensional. Even at this stage, it becomes clear that the higher the number of dimensions, the more information the space contains. But quantum physics claims that 3-dimensional space is not the only option. So let's move on. Shouldn't we return to geometric analogies? After the 2-dimensional flat square comes the 3-dimensional cube, which has length, width, and height. This is the very same cube we first used to lay out the word Mao. But with a tesseract of 4-dimensional hypercube, it's unlikely that we'll be able to do the same. It's not easy to even imagine it, but we'll try anyway. To illustrate a 4-dimensional cube in 3-dimensional space, it's enough to draw 2 familiar 3D cubes and connect them with lines. But the real craziness begins when the tesseract starts to rotate. But what does the 5th dimension look like in geometric terms? Meet the 5-dimensional cube or pentaract, which has 32 vertices, 80 edges, and just as many faces. Inside it, there are 40 familiar cubes and 10 tesseracts because in 5-dimensional space, it is possible to draw 5 mutually perpendicular lines through each point. Try to imagine that if you can. However, let's leave geometry aside and think about how this looks in practice. Once again, remember the tesseract. A tesseract is a set of 3D cubes placed one after another and connected by line segments. So, if you abstract it, it's easy to notice that one cube seems to be the shadow of the other. So what can we see in 5-dimensional space? Following this logic, 5D is the trace of a perpendicular movement of four-dimensional space, but in 5 different directions. It's reasonable to assume that events in such a multi-layered world reflect on each other. This means that if something happens in the 5th dimension, we will feel it too. After all, the reality we're used to also includes 1 and 2-dimensional worlds. But how can we imagine ourselves in a 4 or 5-dimensional world? It's just as difficult as if a resident of a 2-dimensional reality tried to rotate a square, imagining it as a cube. How can you do that if you only have 2 coordinates at your disposal? We also don't understand exactly what direction a tesseract, let alone a pentaract, rotates in. What parameters are added in addition to height, length, and width? Where is this mysterious 4th or 5th orthogonal axis? The brain of the average person simply refuses to believe in something like this. It rejects these illusions as obvious nonsense. But just because we don't understand or can't see something doesn't mean it doesn't actually exist. But scientists have suggested what exactly could become the 4th dimension in addition to the 3 we already know. What do you think? In which 4th direction does a tesseract rotate? It's nesting, meaning the ability of one space to penetrate into another. So we can see some things from the 4th and even the 5th dimension, and maybe even go there ourselves. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Remember what we said about the properties of our vision. An inhabitant of 0-dimensional space can only see the same points as an inhabitant of a 1-dimensional world. What is within his field of perception, that is, on the segment. And the one whose universe is limited to a plane will only notice the imprint of a 3-dimensional object. So by analogy with the inhabitants of other spaces, people can only see the shadows of objects or beings from the 4th and 5th dimensions, but not what they really are. The features of our visual apparatus do not allow us to do this. Do you know what advantage the inhabitants of higher dimensions have over those of lower ones? They are allowed to break the laws of physics in foreign, less developed worlds. For example, Schrodinger's cat could easily get out of the box if it were locked in there by inhabitants of a 2-dimensional space. Why? Because there can't be any box there, only solid line segments. Then we'd know for sure if he's alive or dead. And the thought experiment would have failed. But this is a vision of the characteristics of the 4th and 5th dimensions from the point of view of physical and geometric laws. However, you can look at this from another angle, an energetic one. Do you want an example? Please. There is an opinion that in the 4th dimension, the spiritual and material components merge. Nowadays, a person either gets caught up in the race for material goods or turns to spirituality and essentially shuts themselves off from the world. In the 4th dimension, there will finally be a balance between these spheres. It turns out that people or other beings in this ideal world will become happier. We wouldn't draw sweeping conclusions. Too many dystopias prove the opposite. If everything is so rosy in the 4th dimension, then what awaits us in the 5th? Let's voice some theories. According to one of them, in the 5th dimension, people will gain the ability to self-heal and rejuvenate themselves, will be able to renew their own cellular structure, interfere with DNA chains, and activate longevity programs. So that's where ancient alchemists should have searched for the elixir of youth. But you can assume anything you want. Any hypothesis is interesting in its own way, but there is still no absolutely reliable information. Sometimes it feels upsetting. It's as if humanity is trapped in a 3D prison and can't find a way out. Are we really sentenced to spend our whole lives in a world limited by 3 coordinates? Or maybe that's not such a bad thing. Imagine what would happen if our world suddenly started transforming into a 4-dimensional reality, and another coordinate appeared with all its unknowns. We don't know about you, but we're absolutely not ready for that. In that scenario, not only would the inhabitants of Earth disappear, but the planet itself. the entire solar system and the whole universe would vanish as well. They will completely rearrange themselves like a puzzle that has been taken apart and then replaced with another one. Planet orbits as we know them will vanish. The sun itself, even the structure of the atom will change beyond recognition. And that means everything made of them will disappear forever. That is, everything that surrounds us. This is what would happen if we entered the fifth dimension right now. But is it really that catastrophic? Actually, no, because during our lifetime, it's unlikely that anything in the world will be rearranged. However, this idea has always inspired and fascinated science fiction writers. Remember the novel Flatland by Edwin Abbott, or the work And He Built a Crooked House by Robert Heinlein. You do know that often the fantasies of creative people eventually come true, right? And when you look at some paintings by Picasso and other artists working in the Cubist style, it seems as if they have already moved into the fourth or even the fifth dimension. To sum up, let's note that quantum physics does not deny our world is multidimensional, although it does not specify how many dimensions exist outside the paradigm we are used to. The phrase extraterrestrial beings attracts completely different people, both those who are interested in science and fans of science fiction. So, what does modern science say about extraterrestrial forms of life? And why do we see more and more sensational headlines about unidentified space objects in the media? There is a scientist named Abraham Loeb. At first glance, there is nothing unusual. His publications can be found in reputable scientific journals. He is a scientist from Harvard. However, the main difference between Abraham Loeb and most of his colleagues is that he is especially interested in the topic of extraterrestrial life, and he often attributes certain phenomena in space to extraterrestrial life. For example, in 2017, the first interstellar object, Oumuamua, was discovered. At that time, the popular theory was that it was an elongated fragment from a large rock. However, Loeb suggested that it was either a fragment of a technological device from extraterrestrial beings, or even their spacecraft. In his reasoning, the scientist relied on the fact that the discovered object's acceleration was higher than it should have been under those conditions. The acceleration occurs as a result of a gravity assist around the sun. However, there were also additional forces, the nature of which was not explained at the time. And so Abraham Loeb suggested that the cause of the additional acceleration was not gravitational forces, but quite possibly something artificial, similar to an engine. At the same time, it's important to keep in mind that this is not the only theory. There are also less unusual explanations. A kind of natural engine can form when, as a result of heating from the sun, the ice that was part of the object turns into a gaseous state. This is quite a common phenomenon for comets. However, the thing is, with Oumuamua, no such processes were observed. Of course, this might lead one to think that Abraham Loeb is actually right in his reasoning. However, we cannot fully rely on this theory. Our instruments might not have detected such processes on the object, and they simply went unnoticed by us. There are other theories about what happened. Oumuamua and similar objects contain a fairly large amount of water ice. As a result of the action of cosmic rays, hydrogen formed inside the object. And when Oumuamua came close to the sun, the hydrogen simply began to escape, which contributed to the additional acceleration. Yes, none of the theories have been confirmed yet. A lot still needs to be clarified. However, not everything can be explained solely by fantastic theories about extraterrestrial civilizations. In the case of Oumuamua, the situation is more or less straightforward. Aliens are hardly involved here. But what could extraterrestrial life forms look like? The study of hypothetical life on other objects in the universe, apart from Earth, is the responsibility of astrobiology. We're talking about the probable existence of living organisms not in some distant galaxy, but in our own solar system. So, which objects should we pay attention to?
So, in the habitable zone besides Earth, Venus is of particular interest. The size of this planet is almost the same as our own. At the same time, Venus has incredibly high temperatures, so it's quite logical to conclude that no living creature could survive there. At the same time, it is assumed that in earlier periods, the planet had more suitable conditions. And possibly there were even oceans that later disappeared due to the greenhouse effect. At first glance, it seems obvious. But the thing is, researchers have discovered phosphine at an altitude of about 50 kilometers in low concentrations. This is a colorless gas, which is sometimes also called an indicator of extraterrestrial life. The thing is, phosphine is formed as a result of the activity of anaerobic organisms. So how did they end up on a planet with such harsh conditions? Unfortunately, there's no reason to expect a miracle here. Most likely, phosphine can be produced by volcanic emissions which exist on Venus, greatly reducing the chances of living organisms being there. Besides Venus, another planet where life could have existed in the past is Mars, which is also located in the habitable zone. It is believed that there used to be many lakes and oceans on its surface. However, after some time, under the influence of radiation and solar winds, the atmosphere became increasingly thin. Since then, Mars has become a cold and harsh planet. In theory, we could discover, for example, fossils of organisms that once existed. Phosphine was detected in the atmosphere of Venus, and methane in the atmosphere of Mars. The formation of methane may be related to the reaction of water with the natural environment or to the metabolism of various organisms. It is possible that some primitive forms of life may exist in the inner layers of the planet. Be that as it may, there is still much to be discovered. However, don't think that we will only be talking about planets. Life forms could also hypothetically exist on moons. For example, let's take Jupiter's moon Europa. The moon is covered by a thick layer of ice. There could very well be an ocean of liquid water beneath that layer. On Europa, because the ocean washes out mineral compounds from the rocky part of the moon, there could also be the necessary substances for hypothetical organisms. Also, for methane to form, hydrogen peroxide is needed, traces of which are also present on Europa. And that's not all. On the moon, the ocean can be heated. Because when the layers inside Europa shift, friction occurs and accordingly thermal energy is generated. And all this increases the likelihood of the existence of living organisms. It is assumed that the first link in the food chain will be chemotrophs. Since such organisms oxidize energy-rich chemical compounds, this can become a source of energy for other organisms. Enceladus, the moon of Saturn, also stood out. Here, the situation is similar to the one with Europa. There is also an icy layer on the surface and a liquid ocean beneath it. However, the peculiarity of Enceladus is that it periodically ejects material from its underground ocean outward. By the way, the Cassini spacecraft once caught this. As a result, we learned some information about the composition of the underground ocean. There is methane and hydrogen there, which indicate the possibility of forming life and essential fuel. Complex organic molecules were also detected. The same ones can be found in the oceans on our planet. Another moon of Saturn is Titan. It's even more interesting here. Nitrogen makes up most of the atmosphere of this body. The same situation is found in Earth's atmosphere. Moreover, there are bodies of water on Titan, although they are made up of ethane and methane hydrocarbons. Accordingly, as a result, over the course of a month, there are many opportunities for organisms to emerge that go beyond our understanding of the very essence of living organisms by Earth's standards. Of course, at the moment we know that living organisms of various sizes exist only on Earth. However, scientists continue to study the possibility of the development of living organisms on other bodies in the solar system. And it is also possible that some organisms could come to us from other cosmic systems. Every year we learn something new about the universe, so anything is possible.
Sinister, mysterious concepts are most often encountered only in horror movies, aren't they? But here you're wrong. The sinister is everywhere. It surrounds us. But what's truly terrifying is that we don't even notice it. So, the uncanny valley. One of those concepts. You might not be familiar with this phrase, but you've probably encountered this phenomenon before. You just didn't know what to call it. So, what is it? The uncanny valley. And how can it manifest itself in space? Let's get acquainted with the term uncanny valley. It refers to the moment when an object that has many human features, but not all, and is not actually a human, causes you to feel aversion or a sense of dislike. In most cases nowadays, this usually refers to robots. A person feels sympathy and a certain connection with an object that has the greatest number of human characteristics. After all, it's just like us. Technology has advanced to the point where sometimes, at first glance, it's very difficult to tell whether you're looking at a person or an artificially created object. However, it's impossible to make everything identical to human features. And these details still remain, even though sometimes they're hard to notice at first glance. Such little things can make a person feel afraid. That's how we end up in the uncanny valley when we see what seems to be a human being, but at the same time our brain bumps into features that aren't typical for a person. It seems like there's a person in front of you, but not quite a person. When we encounter the uncanny valley, we feel anxiety and even panic. Sigmund Freud wrote about this phenomenon, but the term itself appeared in the 1970s thanks to the Japanese roboticist Masahiro Mori. The scientist then called the effect the Valley of Eeriness. In 1978, the term we are familiar with today, the Uncanny Valley, appeared in a publication called Robots: Facts, Fiction, and Predictions. Mori, while studying the uncanny valley effect, noted that the more human-like features a robot has, the more positive emotions it will evoke in a person. However, the good impression of the robot doesn't last long. At some point, all the positive feelings are replaced by rejection. And in this case, the level of anxiety will be higher if the robot has more human-like features. Mori, during his research, also created a graph that illustrates the situation more clearly. You can see objects marked by their level of attractiveness and similarity to a human. Here, such objects are marked as a human, a robot doll, a prosthetic hand, and a stuffed animal. If you look closely at the graph, you'll notice this trend. The attractiveness of the object increases, and as its similarity to a human increases, the attractiveness also rises, but then it suddenly drops sharply. As a result, on the graph we see something like a deep dip. This is the uncanny valley, but why? That's the main question. It is quite likely that such humanoid devices make people think about the fact that life is not infinite, that death awaits us all. However, for now we cannot say for sure, as scientists have not reached a consensus. It is also difficult to fully explain right now why our attraction to objects with human features drops so sharply. There are several theories about this. First, all of this goes back to the times when primitive people faced far more dangers than we do now. They could easily lose their lives if they didn't notice a stranger in time. That's why it's important to quickly recognize human features, determine whether someone is a stranger or not, and act accordingly without wasting a minute. The second theory again comes down to the human desire to survive. But according to this version, the brain identifies a humanoid object not as a stranger, but as something contagious and therefore dangerous. The third theory is quite similar to the previous ones. According to it, when we see some distortions or inconsistencies in its appearance, we can't understand what the object thinks about us, what its true desires and intentions are, and whether it poses a threat. The uncanny valley effect can also arise from the fact that we have difficulty categorizing the object. for example, as either a mechanical device or as a human. Humans and entities that are not human are completely different categories. However, the combination of elements from different categories leads to a certain dissonance. A person won't be bothered by a robot with a mechanical voice, but if it starts speaking, for example, in a deep male voice, the reaction will be completely different. Fear and anxiety. Robots often have unnatural smiles, slow movements, unblinking pupils, unnatural pauses in speech, and a pitch of voice that isn't typical for a human. This also triggers the uncanny valley in a more pronounced form. We can definitely say that slow reactions are the most frightening. The emergence of the uncanny valley effect can also be explained by the fact that people have the ability to empathize and feel compassion. We also show empathy toward objects that have human features. At the same time, we subconsciously understand that all these machines cannot show the same feelings toward us. Usually we consider people who lack empathy to be psychopaths. Do you know what other trait might scare you? Symmetry. This might surprise you, but remember that we humans are not actually symmetrical ourselves, even though we usually don't notice it. We have an asymmetrical face shape, lip contours, and placement of freckles. It's important to remember that on a subconscious level, these features are deeply imprinted. In humanoid objects, all components are usually symmetrical. Seeing this, our brain simply goes into a panic. An example of the uncanny valley is the movie Cats, which was released in 2019. It featured CGI graphics. The characters seem to be human, but at the same time, they have many feline traits. Such creatures terrified viewers and caused cognitive dissonance. And that's an example from cinema, but similar things happen during space exploration as well. For example, human models used to monitor indicators during a spacecraft flight can also instill just as much fear in those who work with them. The strength of the uncanny valley effect can vary. Both gender and age influence this. Studies have shown that the effect is less pronounced in women. This can be explained by the influence of society. We have a stereotype that women should be more empathetic. Regarding age, babies under 6 months old hardly experience the effects of the uncanny valley. So we still have to figure out what role social attitudes play here. No matter how susceptible a particular person is to the uncanny valley, encountering it in real life would be, to put it mildly, unpleasant. This effect is only appropriate in horror movies. That's exactly why we go there. And that's exactly why filmmakers so often introduce killer dolls like Chucky into the plot. They will terrify the audience much more. Of course, we would all like the uncanny valley to remain only on the big screen. However, with the advancement of technology, we have become surrounded by an increasing number of humanoid robots, including during space exploration. If an astronaut finds himself on the same spacecraft with such an object, the uncanny valley effect will be felt much more strongly. After all, it's a confined space with a limited number of real people. Then we are left with the question, is there any way to avoid the uncanny valley? Yes, there is. As you can imagine, we can't stop using robots in our work. They do a lot of important work. We can use those mechanisms that don't have human features and accordingly don't imitate humans. That way we won't feel any aversion towards such objects. So, in that case, should we give up on humanoid robots? No, we shouldn't. The thing is, we are constantly improving our technologies, and further development will lead to more natural-looking humanoid objects that will no longer cause the uncanny valley effect. We can work on synchronizing all the robot's actions and taking into account the natural structure of the human body. The uncanny valley phenomenon remains understudied. We still have a lot to learn. Perhaps in the future, even in the near future, robots will be so realistic that we won't be able to tell them apart from real people. Accordingly, the brain won't see anything suspicious, and all these objects won't cause any anxiety. Who knows? Maybe someday our main problem will be telling a human from a robot. And what do you think? Will modern technology advance far enough that we will stop feeling the uncanny valley effect? Or will the brain never be fooled?